Hey guys, welcome. This video is about AWS AppSync, which is a managed GraphQL offering from AWS. And today we are going to create a simple Angular application that talks to a GraphQL server, which is built on AWS AppSync. And we are going to use Amplify library to send request and receive response from the GraphQL endpoint. As you guys may know, Amplify is a front-end library that makes our life easy to talk to AWS backend resources. So let's get started. Now, before I move on, I want to give a quick introduction to GraphQL API. Now, GraphQL API is quite fast and flexible comparing to REST API. Because unlike REST, in GraphQL, it's the client who decides what data it needs from the server. For example, let's say there's a web page that needs to populate with some data. So the client or the browser decides, okay, these are the data that I have to populate in this page. So server, please give this data to me. So it requests the data in terms of a query from the server, and server will fetch the corresponding data and send it back to the client. So it can easily populate the page. And GraphQL, of course, it operates over HTTP. And unlike REST, guys, we can use fewer HTTP requests to get our job done. Because the client has the handle, know what data it needs and what query it creates to get the data. So the client doesn't need to send bunch of HTTP requests to get whatever the data it needs. For the most part, it will get it in one go with a one request. And in GraphQL, the queries are quite flexible, so it's less code to maintain as well. So let's take an example. Now this is a GraphQL query. So in this query, we are basically asking from the GraphQL server, hey GraphQL server, give me this particular user's name and the email address, and also all the blog posts that he has created. So when you send this query to a GraphQL server, you will get a response like this one. So this is a JSON response. Can you see the return data is exactly matching the attributes that the client has requested. For example, here's the user, and here's the user object, and here's the name and the email and the posts. Since the user has multiple posts, so it is returned as an array. So inside this array you have objects. So each object contains title and the body. So how come GraphQL is faster than REST? For example, if it is REST, we may have to get the user's name and the email and the ID first using a one HTTP call to the server, and then we may have to send the user's ID to a different API endpoint to fetch all the posts of that user. So it could be like couple of requests in order to formulate this type of a data object. But in GraphQL, for the most part, we have only one API endpoint. For that API endpoint, we send the query that we need. So the browser or the client makes this query, and the server will make sure get whatever the corresponding data from different data sources, different tables. For in this case, it might have queries these two fields from the user table and these post from the post table, and aggregate it and send the response back to the user in terms of a JSON object, which can be easily populated on the client. So that's the power of GraphQL, and it is quite fast. And there are three main operations. We already talked about query. So that is basically fetching the data from the GraphQL API, which corresponds to a GET request in REST. And then we have mutation. Mutation is nothing but changing the data, like creating, updating, deleting a record in the database. In REST, we use post, put, delete requests. But in GraphQL, we send a mutation. And then we have a subscription, so which is basically watching over the changes of particular data. For example, let's say you do a mutation. Let's say you create a new post in the post table, and the clients can always listen onto the post creation mutation. So whenever a new post is added, the changes will pass on to the client in real time. So this is happening through WebSocket in GraphQL. So basically, client is opening up a WebSocket connection to the server, and whenever a mutation is happening, and if the client has a subscription onto that mutation, then it will receive the real-time data. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to GraphQL. So let's go to our demo. I'm opening up a terminal and navigate to desktop. and create a new directory called AppSync. And I will go into AppSync directory and I will open it in Visual Studio Code by typing code space period. So let's create our Angular application first. So I'm going to use Angular CLI. So I open up an integrated terminal here and I have installed Angular CLI, so I can type ng new my app, and I'm going to enable routing as well. So I have the latest Angular CLI and I will choose the styles as a CSS, then start creating my application. Okay, we are going to create a very simple to-do application so that a user can log into the application and then create his or her to-dos. So in our application, I need two components. Let's cd into my app folder. The first component is auth. So I will use gc or the CLI generator to generate the component, and its name is auth. So this auth component, it will comprise of my login screen. And I'm going to use Amplify Auth UI component to integrate login, sign up, and all those screens very simply. So the next component is to do. So this is the component which contains my to-dos. Okay, both the components are created, and if I open my app folder and into the source folder and into the app folder, you should see those two components. So I'm going to set the routing as well. So I will go to app routing module and let's set two paths. Path to do, that will render the to do component, and another default path that render the auth component. So let's see if everything is working. I will type ng-serve. So when I open the application, it should render the default route, and you can see the auth works here. And these are the default content, which we are going to delete it right now. So here's the default content and I will delete it. So I will have only the router component and save it. And here you go. So our default is auth route and it works. And if I go to to-do, the to-do works as well. So now we are going to add Amplify CLI and the Amplify library. So we can add a logging screen instead of this auth works. Okay. So let's stop the server and type npm install -d at AWS Amplify -CLI and hit enter. So this will install the Amplify CLI globally. CLI is installed, so now we can create resources in AWS like AppSync service. Now let's install AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify Angular. So these two libraries will allow us to talk to backend resources via the API. So in order to get these two libraries working, we have to do a small changes in our Angular application. The first one is adding a polyfill. So go to polyfill.ts and on top add this line of script. Windows as any global window, so this will provide a shim for the global object. And in index.html, inside the header tag, you need to add a script tag, and inside the script tag, add this line of code. If global is undefined, set the global to window. And now go to tsconfig.app.json file. Here's this file. And under types array, add node. Because Amplify will use node behind the scene, so we have to add the node type here. Okay, now let's use Amplify CLI to spin up resources. So let me clear the screen. So first we need to create a logging screen. We are going to create a Cognito user pool to hold our users and then allow them to access upon successful authentication. So let's enable authentication with Amplify by typing Amplify and first type help. So you will see all the commands. Now first of all, let's initialize a project even before adding the auth functionality. So I will type Amplify, hope you guys can see it, if not Amplify init, hit enter. So this will initialize the Amplify project in AWS. So choose the default editor, in my case Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to build a JavaScript application which is an Angular, and our source directory is src because our directory name is src. Hit enter. And distribution directory is dist/myapp, which is the name of my app, and build command, hit enter and accept the default, start command ng-serve. So now it asks whether or not I want to use an AWS profile. Now here I say yes, and I'm going to pick my YouTube profile. So if you guys have not configured an IAM profile in your machine, use Amplify configure and add your access key and secret access key with the name of a profile. Okay, now the project is initialized, so let's add auth. So here's the category auth. So in order to add that, let's type Amplify add auth. Select the default configuration. Now this is the default configuration of the user pool. Okay, it is added. Now before you pushing those changes to AWS, I'm going to add API as well. So I will type amplify add API and hit enter. So this time we are going to choose GraphQL API. So select GraphQL, not REST, and provide the API name. I will say my app. And the authorization type, choose Amazon Cognito user pool. Since we have already created a user pool, we can use authorization from that user pool. So Amazon Cognito user pool, and then it will ask, do you have an annotated GraphQL schema? In my case, I do not have anything, so I will say no and hit enter. Do you want a guided schema creation? Hit yes, and then it will ask some information about your project. So is it a one-to-many relationship like blogs and posts, or single object with fields like a to-do application, which exactly what we are building. So let's select single object with fields, and now it will ask, do I need to edit my schema right now? I will say yes and hit enter. It's going to open my schema.graphql. This is my GraphQL schema. So I'm going to change these attributes a little bit for my to-do. So ID is fine for a to-do, name is fine, and instead of description I will type body, and also I will have another attribute called completed, and that's a type of boolean. I will save it and come back to my editor and hit enter. Okay, it is created locally. Now when I type amplify publish or push, so what happens is amplify will create my GraphQL API. So it will look at my schema definition. So this one, GraphQL schema, and it will create an AppSync service, and it will create a DynamoDB table with these fields. And also it will link that DynamoDB table with the AppSync service, and also add the necessary configuration to create, read, delete, update records in that table as well. So that's very convenient for us as a developer. So let's type amplify push, and it will ask these are the things or the resources that it's going to configure in cloud, the auth, the Cognito user pool, and for the API, my app, AppSync API. So I will agree by typing yes and hit enter. So then it's going to ask me, do you want to generate code for the newly created GraphQL API? I will say yes, because I need the code for my Angular application. And then it will ask me, okay, give a path pattern to store all the queries, mutation, and subscription. I will accept the default because it's going to create this GraphQL folder inside my source directory and then add all those GraphQL files. So then it further suggests me, okay, now do you want to like create all those example operations like queries, mutations, and subscriptions as well? Of course, I need that. And now it's going to ask for a file to generate that code. I will accept the default, so that will create api.service.ts file, and now it's updating the resource. Now while it is updating, I wanted to attention on this particular directive. So this is the GraphQL schema, and it has this particular directive called @model. So there are multiple directives in Amplify. So @model is one of that. So in this directive, what it does is, as soon as it shows okay this type with this directive, it's going to create a DynamoDB table with these attributes, and as I previously mentioned, it will do all this linking part with the AppSync service together with all the operations. So that's very cool. Alright, it's created. You can see it has given me the GraphQL endpoint as well. So as you can see, it has created a lot of files here. Here the log says generated GraphQL operation successfully saved at source GraphQL folder. So let's see, this is our source folder and this is the GraphQL folder. And inside the GraphQL, you should see all the queries. And you see, we have a get to do query, get all the to dos like list to dos query, and then we have mutations like creating a to do, update and delete to do mutation, and also subscriptions as well. So we can subscribe to like on create to do. As soon as a to do is created, we can just listen for that and get the content. So apart from that, you should see there's this aws-export.js file, and it has all the configuration that Amplify has provision in my AWS account. So it has Cognito, user pool information, and also the GraphQL information, etc. Now we need to do one thing. So let's just take a copy of this file and paste it in the source directory again. And instead of .js file, I'm going to rename it as aws-export.ts file. Now we can import this file into our Angular components. Now let me show you one other thing. If you go to Amplify folder here and into the backend, into this API folder, and inside app folder you should see the build folder. Go inside that, then you should see this folder called resolvers. Now open it up. When you open it up, you should see there are multiple resolvers for creating to-dos and deleting to-dos, updating, getting, and listing to-dos. For each resolver, there's a request template. This is the request template for create to do, and this is the response template for creating to dos. And here's the request and response template for get to do. Now, what is this, guys? In GraphQL, when the browser sends a query to the API, let's say it's asking to get a particular to do, right? Then we have to write a resolver in order to do that operation. So if we want to get the to-dos, we have to query the DynamoDB table and get the corresponding to-do matching with the to-do ID, right? So we can do that in different ways. In GraphQL, we can have resolvers either by using the data source. For example, in this case, it is the DynamoDB. So we can use the DynamoDB get item operation. So you can see the operation is get item, and the key, this is the hash key or the primary key. So that is corresponding to the ID of the to-do. So this is the one of the options that you can write the resolvers. Or else you can write a lambda function and hook that as a resolver, and inside that lambda function you can talk to the DynamoDB and get the result and send it back to the client. So there are multiple ways that you can attach resolvers. So the request template is basically you are requesting the data from the data source, in this case DynamoDB, and the return data, you can like modify that return data back into a GraphQL response. So you can like restructure it as a GraphQL response. But if you want to do like further filtering before sending the response, you can add this here. So that's about getting to do. So how about creating to do? So that's a mutation. So when you send that mutation, you can again use DynamoDB operation, put item operation, and then for this new key, and add those attributes that is coming along through the mutation and create a new to-do item. And here also, instead of using this velocity template and using the DynamoDB put item operation, you can use a lambda function to talk to DynamoDB using DynamoDB SDKs and do that operation as well. Okay, so now let's add the Amplify login to our application. So in order to use Amplify, we have to do a little bit of configuration. So let's go to source folder and into our app and into app.module.ts, and we have to import some libraries. So what library do I have to import? I'm going to import Amplify service and Amplify Angular module from AWS Amplify Angular library. And I will add the module inside the imports here and the Amplify service as the provider. So now that we have the Amplify Angular module imported, we can use the UI component provided from the AWS Amplify Angular for authentication. So let's go to our auth component and go to auth component.html file. And here, instead of authworks, let me delete it and I will paste in the Amplify Authenticator directive. This will add all the UI components for login, logout, forget password, sign up, etc. But in order to do some styling, let's import Amplify styles into our styles.scss file. So I will go to styles.scss file, and here I'm going to import AWS Amplify Angular /theme.scss. Now let's see how our application looks by typing ngserve, and when we go to localhost 4200, yes, I should see this nice UI. So now let's add some code to our to-do component as well. I will remove this to-do works template and I will paste in this code. So there's this div, the wrapper div around. So inside that I have two buttons. First one is to create a to-do and the other one is to get all the to-dos. So create to-do is linked with the create to-do function. Get to-do is linked with get to-dos function. And then we have another div. This div will iterate over all the to-dos and print out the to-do name and the body and whether or not it is completed. I will upload this code into GitHub and link it so you guys can see it as well. Okay guys, let me change this get to do to list to dos because you are listing all the to dos here. And now let's create those functions. Let's go to our TS file and first one is create to do and list to dos. Now in order to create to do, I'm not going to use any like input boxes and get the actual to do content from the user, but instead I'm going to like generate a couple of to-dos when someone hit this button. So let me paste in this code. So const new to-do, and I have given the to-do name as to-do and then a random value between 1 to 100, and sample description, and this is the completed status, which is false. And now we have to use create to do mutation. So for that, let's use Amplify API. Now, before actually use Amplify, we haven't configured it properly. We got to do a small thing. So let's go to a main.ts file, which is our main Angular file that get bootstrapped. And there we need to import Amplify from AWS Amplify library like this. Import Amplify from AWS-Amplify, and then we have to import that AWS export file. If you can remember, guys, the Amplify generated this AWS export.js file, and we created this TS file. Of course, we can like use a script to do this conversion, but we'll like copy paste for now. So we are importing that particular export file as well. Then we are using amplify.configure and passing that particular export file. So that's it. So once you do this amplify configure, Amplify know, okay, these are the resources that it can talks to, and these are the metadata that it can use. For example, AppSync URL. Let's do another thing. If you can remember, Amplify has created this API.service file. So this has all the mutations, queries, and subscription of AppSync. So we need to import this API service. If you want, you can put it to the app module as a provider, so you can use it throughout your components. But in my case, I will only use in the to-do component. So how can we use it? Let me go to to-do component, and on top, let me import that one directory up and API service, and I think that is called API service. Yeah. So let's import our service as well. And here in the constructor, let's create a private variable, call it API of API service. So now we can use this API private variable in order to talk to our AppSync endpoint. So let's go into our method, which is create to do. So we have this new to do, and in order to call this mutation, we have to use our API, this dot API dot, and it is create to do, and it will take the input as the to do input, which is nothing but our new to do. Let me just copy it and paste it in. Okay. Now this function is asynchronous function, guys, so we need to wait for that, and let's take the result into a variable called result. Why not? And since we are using await, we have to like create this function as a async function. All right, and let me just put a debug point here just to stop it at this point and inspect the result. And for list to dos, what do we need? Let's create another variable called all to dos. Then that is what we have referenced in our loop. Yes, it is all to dos, and let's call our API again, API dot list to dos, and you don't have to pass any parameters here. Again, we have to make this function async, and rather we'll define this all to dos on top, and here let's call it this dot all to dos, and on ng on init. So this is the function that called when this component is initialized. So let's call the same thing here as well. When we refresh the page, it will always like call this function. And here also let's do another change. So once you have successfully created it, let's push that to do into our all to do list. This dot all to dos dot push the result. Okay. Let's see if it is compiling it all right. Yes, I think so. And I will go to localhost 4200, nothing. Let's inspect it. Process is not defined. I think there's another problem in Angular 6 where we need to use another shim for that. So let's go to polyfill.js. So in the polyfill.js, if you can remember, we had a polyfill for the global object, and also we need to have a polyfill for the process object. This is a workaround that I found on internet. So let's set this one window as any process, the script, and save it. And now let's do a refresh. There you go. Now it works. Now we are at localhost 4200. Okay, now this is our login page. Since you guys don't have any account created, you click create account and sign up for a new account with a username, password, an email, and those stuff. And afterwards you will receive an email to your email address with the confirmation code. Add that in, and then you are good to sign in. I have already created a user, so let me log in with him, mjson, and click sign in here. You should see the inspect element, the network tab, all the calls that it does for the backend. So it's calling the Cognito API. And once you are successfully signed in, Cognito will send you all the tokens, ID token, access token, and refresh token, and they will be stored in the local storage. So you can see it has grabbed my name, hello mjson, and let's go to to-do endpoint. Now that we are signed in, you can see our two buttons. Okay, we got an error. So let's see. Yeah, we need to define this as an array, all to-dos, and then here let's take this into a variable. Let result and assign this dot all to-dos as results dot items, because there's this items attribute that these to-dos will be populated. Okay, and here also the same thing. Let me just copy these two lines, and when you click list to-dos, it will show that as well. Okay, I think now it looks good. Let's see. There you go. Now I have all these to-dos I created. So I got 9, 68, 18, and 78. Let's create another one. 88, and if I refresh it, yeah, I should get all those things right. And if you go to inspect element and into the network tab, let's inspect what happens when you click create to-dos. It's calling the GraphQL API and it's calling the create to-do mutation. So it is passing the body, completed or not, all that, right? Okay, so this is one of the ways that we can work with AppSync endpoint with Amplify GraphQL client. But this Amplify GraphQL client does not support offline functionality. So if you want offline functionalities and those complex features, you have to use AppSync SDK. But this GraphQL AppSync client is really great for handling mutations, queries, and subscription quite easily. Alright guys, so this video is about modeling relationship in GraphQL when you are using AppSync and Amplify library. I will give you an example on how do you model one-to-one relationship, one-to-many relationship, and many-to-many relationship in your applications. So throughout this video, I'm going to use one of these examples to demonstrate this relationship. So this is one of the very common example. So let's say you have these three entities. You have departments, and you have employees, and also you have projects. So let's see what are the relationship between departments, employees, and projects. So one of the relationship that we are going to map is a department has a manager. Let's see this one. So department has a manager. So that manager is also included in the employees, right? So of course a manager is also an employee. So a department has a manager. So what type of relationship is that? It's a one-to-one mapping because one department has only a one manager, right? And also the second relationship we are going to do is a department has many employees. Of course, a department has many employees. So one department has many employees. So what type of relationship is that? It's a one-to-many relationship, or we denote it as 1:m or 1:n, right? And finally, we are going to look at one many-to-many relationship as well. So that is nothing but a project has many employees. Let's say a project. So we have a project entity. A project has many employees. Let's say many employees are assigned to one particular project. And on the other hand, a single employee can be in multiple projects as well. So one project has many employees and one employee can be assigned to many projects. So what type of relationship is that? That's a many-to-many relationship. Alright guys, so let's see how do we map this relationship quite easily with Amplify library. Alright, so head over to Amplify library website. So at this particular link. Now guys, in the previous video we talked about Amplify library and GraphQL introduction. So if you guys want to watch it, I will put a link up here. And once you are in the documentation, you should see how to install the Amplify library. So it's basically a simple npm install. And then you can use Amplify init to initialize a project in AWS Cloud. So let's take a terminal and create a new directory called relationships. Cd into relationships. And inside this folder, let's create an Angular application. ng new my app. Well, you can use Angular, React, Vue, or any other front-end framework, but in my case, I use Angular. Yes, I want to add routing, and I'm going to use SCSS. So once your app is created, go into the folder and open it in a code editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code here. Alright, now I open up an integrated terminal and let's initialize a new Amplify project by typing Amplify init. Okay, the editor I'm using is Visual Studio Code and it's a JavaScript application. It's an Angular application. So if you guys like spin up a React application, use React or Vue, in my case Angular. And the source directory, it's src folder and my build file resides in dist/my app. My app is the name of my app. and hit enter. Build command is this one, ngserve. All right. And now it's using CloudFormation to initialize the project. So do I want to use AWS profile? Yes, because I have this particular profile for my YouTube. All right, so now project is now successfully initiated in the cloud. So now I can add API. So let's add our GraphQL API by typing amplify add API and hit enter. Choose GraphQL and hit enter again. An API name, I will just choose the default name, my app. And the authorization type, well, I'm going to choose Cognito user pool. And then it asks me, okay, do I need to add the default configuration to the Cognito user pool? I will just select default configuration. If you want, like, you can go through the setup and customize the configuration. Now it asks, do I have a GraphQL schema? In my case, I do not. So I will type N and hit enter. Do you want a guided schema creation? Yes. Then it will suggest me like three types of schemas, single object with fields, one-to-many relationship, and fine-grained access. So in this case, I will choose one-to-many relationship. That will give me a blog post schema. And do you want to edit the schema now? I will hit yes. And now it's going to open up the schema file. So minimize the integrated terminal. And so this is the created blog post schema. So in our case, we don't need this one because we have department, employees, and projects. So I will delete it. So let's start building our schema. So first type is department. So what field does the department has? It has an ID of ID. So capital ID is a common type that we denote ID in GraphQL. And department has a name of string. Yeah, that should be it. So our department has an ID and its name. And now I'm going to use a directive from Amplify library called @model. So this @model directive will create a DynamoDB table for department, and also it's going to create all the GraphQL mutation, queries, and subscription for department model or department type. So what is the next entity? So let's create our employee, and let's use the same directive here because we want to create a table for employees as well. So our employees also has an ID and a name, and let's add age as well. So now let's add our first relationship. So what is our first relationship? A department has a manager. So in the departments, let's add another field called manager, and that manager is again an employee, right? Now before that, let me just take out this S and keep it single. Sorry about that. So this manager is again an employee. So manager is type of employee. Okay. So we are referencing this type when it comes to manager. So this is ID and string are Scala type in GraphQL, but when you are referencing another type, these are called non-Scala type. So in order to make this a one-to-one relationship, let's add another directive called connection. So we are making a connection on manager to this particular employee type. Now here's what happens. When Amplify compiles this schema with these directives, it's going to create this department table in the DynamoDB, and it's going to create ID attribute, name attribute, and it's going to create another reference for the manager by adding an attribute called manager ID. So department table then has a reference to the manager's ID. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to open up the integrated terminal again and hit enter, and then I will type amplify push. So now Amplify is going to compile the code and create a CloudFormation template, and then it create all the resources. So answer yes to all these questions. All right, so it has given me the GraphQL endpoint, and let me go to AWS console and see the resources that it created. And if I go to AppSync, I should see my new API, my app. And go into that, if you go to the schema, you should see the full schema that it has created. You see, it has added all these input types and mutations, subscriptions, etc. So let's go to DynamoDB as well, because it should create a table for department and employees. So these are my two tables. And also let me go to AWS Cognito, because we are using Cognito authorization. So if I open it in a new tab, I should see my new Cognito user pool. So here's my user pool. So in the AppSync console, let's try to create a query. Let's try to create a department. Now, I first have to log in with the user pool because that's how the authorization happens. So in order to do that, I need to provide the client ID and username and password of a particular user. So let's create a user here. In the user pool, I will click create user, and okay, Manoj F is fine. and I don't need to send any invitation. Add a temporary password, guys, and just untick this one, manoj@test.com, and create the user. Okay, user is created. And now go to app clients, because we need to just copy the client ID and make sure you're not using the one with the secret key, but without the one, this one. So just copy in the client ID. In the AppSync console, client ID, paste that in, and your password and the username. Okay, now I'm logged in as Manoj. Okay, now if you click docs here, you should see your schema. And let's see what are the mutation that I have. If I click mutation link here, I have this create department mutation, right? So let's try to create that one. We'll type mutation create department, and the field name is create department. Input. So what are the input types? So if you go to create department, you should see the input type is of this particular create department input type. Just click that. Should see what are the required field, and I should give the name, and let's call it engineering department. And department manager ID, since I don't have a user created or the employee created, I can't give it yet. So let's leave it blank, and later on we'll update the department. And the create departments outputs are departments. So in the department, I can just print out the ID and the name. Right. So now let's run this mutation. Click this button. There you go. It's created. So let's make a note of the department ID, and I will just copy this and I will put it in a notepad. Okay, so this is the department ID. And guys, let's create an employee as well. Let's create employee. You can just name this one any name, but when you're choosing the field type, make sure to pick the right one. Okay, an input type colon and open braces. If I go to mutation, always use the documentation, it's quite easy. And create employee, you should see the input type is create employee input, and it accepts name and age, right? So name, let's say John Doe, and age 21, and the mutation returns an employee. See, so employee has the name and the ID. I will just print out the name and the ID. Okay, let's close this out and click this one and select create employee. Okay, John Doe is created. Let me just note down these two as well. John Doe ID is this one. Let's create two more employees. Jane Doe of age 28, and create the employee and just note the ID as well here. And also another employee, Manoj Fernando, create employee. Make a note. So now that is created, so let's see if it is updated in our database, right? So if I go to DynamoDB, and if I go to department table and into the items, I should see my first department is created. See, department, engineering department. Can you see I still don't have that manager ID? So let's add a manager to our department. So I will go to AppSync, and this time I'm going to use the update mutation. Let's call update manager. So the mutation name, let's see what is that name. Update department. Okay, update department. And as for the input type, okay, update department input. If I go into that, I can individually update these attributes. So in this case, I need department manager ID. So let's add John Doe as our engineering department manager. Department manager's ID. So let me quickly copy John Doe's ID here, paste it in here. Department ID, that will return me the name. Okay, I can just return whatever the values here, and let me just run the update manager mutation. Oh, we got an error because we have to give the ID of the department as well. So department ID that we are going to change is this one. So this is the engineering department. Sorry about that. So of course you have to add the department ID that we are going to update. So make sure to add the department ID here and the department manager ID, which is our John Doe's ID, right? And then run again. All right, so it is updated. So let's see if it is updated. I will click refresh and open this up. You see the department manager ID. So this is how we create one-to-one relationship. Now let's add the other relationships as well. So let's add this one. A department has many employees. I will go to my schema. Now department has a manager, one-to-one relationship, and department has many employees. So let's add another attribute here. Let's call it employees, and that is an array of employee type. So its employees are array of employees. So arrays is denoted with brackets. So we are referencing the employee type in an array because it's a list of employees, right? And let's add another connection here. Now guys, when you add this connection, it works. So when you create one to many relationship, so in this case, department has many employees. When you're creating an employee in the employee table, it should have an attribute called department ID, say department ID, yeah, something like that. So this will reference the department. So every time you create an employee, we should have that particular ID. Now there's a small issue. When you just add employees, it just works. But this particular attribute name, we get it as department employees ID. So it's basically get the type names, department and the employee and the ID, right? Because if you can remember, our manager, it was called department manage ID. Similarly, it will infer a attribute name called department employees ID, right? This doesn't make any sense. So in order to have an attribute that makes sense, let's create a named connection. Now these are unnamed connections, so named connection is quite easy. Just add a brackets and type name, and then you can just add any name here. This is basically a label, guys, some reference, so it can be anything. So let me here just call it department employees. And once you are adding a named connection, you have to have another field in the corresponding table. So this is referencing the type employee. So in our employee type, let's add another reference to the department as well. So let's call it department, and it's the type of department. And let's add the same name connection here as well. So we have to do this by directional mapping in order to get this thing working, right? So when you add that, guys, this name could be anything. What changes is the attribute name. So earlier, if we weren't using named connection, the attribute name could be department employees ID. Now it will take the name as employee department ID. So that makes sense, right? Because employee belongs to a department, so employee department ID makes sense. Alright, so now let's compile our schema again. So how can we compile it? Take your integrated terminal and type this command, Amplify API GQL-compile. So this will recompile our schema and update our CloudFormation stack. Now let me reiterate again. Of course, you can take this out and only keep the unnamed connection, right? Because department has many employees. This just works without any doubt, right? But the attribute name is a weird attribute name. So in order to have a meaningful name, something like employee department ID, we need to have a named connection. Okay, it's successfully compiled. Now let's push our changes, amplify push. So once it is completed, let's go back to our AWS console, to AppSync console. Maybe you have to just log out and log in back. Now if you take the docs and go to the mutations, let's see when you create an employee, what are the input types? You see, there's the new input type called employee department ID. You see, now the name matches quite fine because employees has a department ID. Right? So let's update our 3 employees with their corresponding department, shall we? So I will go back to the schema and let's use this update employee mutation. Update employee, and the input type is of, let's see, always use the reference. The ID of the employee is, let's start with John Doe ID and employee department ID. So let's add the department, engineering department ID. This is this one, and you can just get the name if you want. And then I will update the employee. Alright, it's successfully updated. Similarly, let's update the other 2 employees as well. Jane Doe, just change the employee ID here. Don't change this one because we are adding to the same engineering department, so that is the department ID, and run the update employee again. Okay, Jane Doe is updated. And finally, Manoj, employee ID, change it and run the mutation, update employee. Okay, now it is updated. Now let's try to query a department and see. So if the department has these employees, get department, what is the query? So this time it's not a mutation, it's a query. Click query and get department query. get department and ID. So we have to provide the ID of our department, and that gives me a department. Click on the return type here, department, and you get all this information, right? So let's print out the department name and the manager. So manager again is a type of employee. You see, manager is another type of employee. If you go into that, you can just print out the manager's name and go back here. So what else do we have? We have employees as well. So employees, and employees are a type of employee connection. It's a type of connection, and it has these items array, because employees are a list of employees and items are list of employees. Click into the employee and everyone has a name, and let's print out their age as well, why not? So now let's execute this query. I will hit play button and click get department. There you go. So we got the data back. So our department name is engineering department. Our manager is John Doe. And these are the employees. Employee 1, 2, 3, Manoj, Jane Doe, and John Doe. Nice. Now I want to show you one other thing. If we go to DynamoDB table and do a refresh on this, and if you go to employees table, first note that you have the employee department ID attribute. And secondly, if you go to indexes, you should see it has created a global secondary index on employee department ID key. So DynamoDB has internally created this index on the employee department ID so that it can query using the employee department ID efficiently. Awesome. So now let's add the many-to-many relationship. So what is our many-to-many relationship? It's basically a project has many employees. An employee can be assigned to many projects. So let's go to our schema. Now we need to have another type called project. And it's also a model. We need to have a DynamoDB table and all the mutations and queries. And it has a ID, project ID, and let's say there's a project name as well. That should be enough. So what should be the relationship? A project has many employees. Yeah. So we can simply add employees of type employee array. Make sense? So employees, it's an array of employee, right? And we can just make this as a connection, right? If you want, like, we can create this named connection as well. And how about the other side? Employee can be assigned to many projects. So employees also can have multiple projects, right? So if you just type projects, and it's a list of project, we can just make this as a connection as well, right? So we have both the relationship. Employee has multiple projects and project has multiple employees. But guys, when you are mapping many-to-many relationships, and if you are only using two tables, when there are a lot of data, the relationships get quite messy. Because you see, the employee table has the relationship to the projects, and the project has relationship to the employees, and one employee could be in multiple projects, and one project has multiple employees. So you have to like have so many number of records in these two tables. It get quite messy quite fast. So one of the ways that we can like model it in a different manner is using a third table. We can create a third table and create two one-to-many relationships and then achieve this many-to-many relationship. Confusing? Let me just show you. So let's create another table called, or type called, let's say, employee projects, right? So when we are naming this table, it could be like employee projects or project employees, whichever makes more sense, right? So in this case, both seems fine, employee projects or project employees. So let's create a model here, and this particular table also has an ID attribute, and I'm going to take out these two early records, this one and this one. Okay, so we can start with a clean slate. So what are we going to do? We are going to create this particular table, employees projects table, and create two one-to-many relationship, employee table to employee projects table, and another one-to-many relationship from project table to employee projects table. So let's create that, shall we? So employee has multiple projects, and that is the type of employee project, not employee type, but employee project, and it has a connection, and we'll call that connection employee projects. Remember, you can name this anything. And once you create one record here, you have to have a reference record here as well. So let's call it employee, because this is the type of employee. And the employee type, and let's have the same connection name here. So we created one of the one-to-many relationships. As we have created one-to-many relationship in department and employees, you see this one. Similarly, we created another one-to-many relationship between employee table and employee projects table, right? So we'll do the second one-to-many relationship from projects to employee projects. So project has many employees, and that is an array of employee project. Let's add a connection with the name project employees. So let's create the reference attribute here. So that is project, because we are referencing the project type, and that is of project type and have the same named connection here. Awesome. So now let's recompile this. Amplify API GQL-compile. Okay, we got no errors. And one other thing, guys, this particular employee projects model, and when we add this particular at model directive, it's going to create all the queries, mutations, subscription, and everything, right? But we are only like adding the records or creating this employee and project reference in this table. We are not going to query anything from this one. So in order to tell Amplify, don't create query types, we can pass additional information with parentheses and say queries null. So it's not going to create any queries, but only the mutations. All right. And let's do another compilation. Okay, it's compiled successfully. Let's do amplify push to push all the changes and like update our resources in AWS. Okay, guys, it's updated. So let's go to our AWS AppSync console and let me log out again and log in. And now if you look at the schema and if you go to mutation, you should see create project and update project. That means it has created project type as well. So let's create a project, guys. So I will type mutation, create project, and let's use create project field and input. So what is the input? Click here. So basically ID is auto generated. You just have to give it a name. Let's call it project X. And then let's get the ID and the name. Okay, execute it, create project. There you go, it's created. And let me take a reference on the project ID. Project X ID is this one. And now let's add Manoj and Jane to this particular project X. So those are the two employees assigned to project X, right? And how do we do that? We are going to create an entry in our employee projects third table. So let's use create employee projects mutation. So I'm going to use mutation add employee to project, and we are going to use create employee projects. And as for the inputs, we have to provide, let's see what are the inputs here, employee ID and the project ID. So employee projects project ID. So what's the project ID? So we are going to associate him with our project X. So let's get this project ID. And who are we going to associate? The employee ID of Jane. All right. So let's get the ID out. So this will assign Jane to our project X. So let's add the employee to that project. Okay, so it's added. And let's add Manoj also. So let's get the Manoj ID, and I'm going to add Manoj to the same project, and let's add the employee to that project. Okay, great. So let's now query that project and see if these two employees are actually added, right? So let's go to docs again, query get project by ID, get project and ID. So what is the ID? Project X ID here. Okay, and the get project returns a project. So inside the project, what do you have? You have name and employees. You see one-to-many relationship there. Name and employees. Now take a look at the type, guys. These employees are type of employee project connection. Yeah. So if you go into this, you should see I will get a list of employees. So I can just query that items, and these items are of type employee projects. So employee project, we have employee and the project. So let's get the employee again, and I will take the name employee. So it will give me the name of this employee. Hope it's clear. So let me just query the project. get project. Here we have it. So our project X, it has these 2 employees. So one project can have many employees. So let's see the other side. That means one employee can have multiple projects. So let's add Manoj to another project, shall we? So first, let me just create a new project. I will use the previous mutation. I will call this as project Y, and let's run this one. Create project. So is the one. So I created it. So this is my project Y. Copy the ID here, project Y. Now let's associate Manoj to that project Y. So project Y ID, I already copied it. So let me just quickly paste it here. So this is the ID of project Y and the employee ID of Manoj. So that is this one. All right. And I'm going to execute add employees to the project. Great. Now if we query Manoj, then we should see all the associated projects. Let's query that. Get employee, query name. Let's get employee. Okay, get employee, and basically you need to give the ID of the employee, which is Manoj ID. And now look at the return type. So this is the get employee, and you will get an employee type out. So in this employee type, there are a bunch of things, right? First, we can get the name, and we can get the age and the department. Oh, we'll just omit department for now because we are concerned about the projects. So I will type projects, and the project is type of project connection, and go into that you get items, that means list of projects, and each of these are of our third table type, which is employee projects, and inside it we can simply get the project, and project is type of again project, and just get the name. Nice. So let's run this query, and it should return both project X and Y ideally. Let's see, get employee. There you go. So Manoj is part of project X and project Y. Great. So now we have completed all these relationships. This video is about real-time updates with GraphQL subscriptions with AWS AppSync. So we have been building upon this particular to-do application, or rather automated to-do application, where we can like click create to-do button and generate list of to-dos into this particular list. So currently we have to-do 50, to-do 33, and if I click create to-do again, I should see to-do 36. All right. So when you click create to do button, it will call upon a GraphQL mutation and create that particular to do in a DynamoDB table. See, if I refresh it, I should see 3 items. Now let's delete like 2 of these. And now if I click get to do's button here, this will call upon a GraphQL query. So in that last video, we looked at how to implement both mutations and queries. So as our server, we used AWS AppSync. So AppSync is our GraphQL server, which is a managed GraphQL server. And in order to like work with this particular server, we used Amplify library. Now here's our AppSync server. So this is the schema. Now in order to work with this server, we used JavaScript Amplify library. The Amplify provides 2 ways to communicate with GraphQL. First by using Amplify GraphQL client. Can you see this one? And also using AWS AppSync SDK. This one. We used Amplify GraphQL client to simply create queries and mutations. And now today we are going to use that to create subscriptions as well. So what really is a subscription, guys? Subscriptions are basically watching over changes in GraphQL. For example, you can watch over a particular mutation, let's say a create to do. So when one of the client creates a to do, so that change or that new to do will be distributed to all other connected clients. Now let me show you this one. Now if I take a new browser window and go to localhost 4200 to do same Angular application, we can simulate another client. Okay. So in the first client or the first browser window, if I click create to do, I will get the to do 41, but my other client will not see that change, right? In order to see that change, he has to like refresh it or like click our get to do's query. There you go. But with subscription, we can transmit all these changes in real time to all those connected clients. So let's see how to do that. So I'm going into my code. So this is our to-do component, HTML, that creates this particular page. I'm going to do a one particular change. Instead of clicking this button and generate this automatic to-do, let's actually allow the user to type something and then click the to-do and then add that custom name as the title of our to-do, shall we? So this is the HTML. So I'm going to take out this list to do buttons and add an input box here of type text. So this will be the place that clients are typing the to do name. And let's add a label to do name. So we can pass the to do name to our create to do function. So let's do that. To do name. And let's change the to do function as well. I will go to do component.ts. And this is our create to do function. Now you will receive the to do name as well here. So instead of this random to do name, let me just add the actual to do name that is passing from the client. So these two attributes, let's keep it as it is. Now before I pass that name, let's check whether it's not empty. If you have a particular length on the to do, so that means just something in the to do, and I will put that in the if block. So now what happens is we will formulate the to do, and then we are going to call upon this create to do mutation, right? Since this is a synchronous function, we are waiting for that, and once the result is received, we are pushing that to do into our all to do's array. Then in the template, we are looping over that all to do arrays and printing out this to do name, body, and to do completed, right? Now let me change these two as well. I will take it out body and completed because these are hard coded values. I will just keep the to do name. Let's see if that looks nice on the browser. Nice. Now we can like type something, wake up at 5 a.m. and click create to do. Yeah, there's a small error. Instead of just to do name, you have to reference the value here as well, right? So to do name dot value will give the name of the to do. So now let's try that. There you go. Now it works. Let's clear this input box as well. To do name dot value equal null. Wake up at 5 a.m. Click the to do. Now it's getting cleared. Okay. So how do you attach subscription here, or how do you push these changes to all the connected clients? Now guys, when you create our schema, Amplify has already created all these mutations, queries, and including subscriptions as well. So if you can remember, in the last time we have been referencing our service, API service, which is generated automatically by Amplify. So this API service also has our subscription code as well. Now this is our API service.ts. Can you see there's this subscriptions called on create subscription, and we have on update subscription, on delete subscriptions. So from our client, we can like subscribe to this subscription. For example, let's say on create subscription. And once we do that, we will receive any newly created to-dos from other clients in real time. So let's try that. So I'm going to reference this on create subscription. So this is actually the type, and if I just search again, you can see on create to do listener returns an observable where we can subscribe to, right? So let's use that. I go to my to do component, and here in my create to do method, instead of pushing this new to do into our old to dos, so I will let the subscription to add that particular new to do into our old to dos array. So let's comment this one out. I will just remove it. I will take this variable out as well. So we are now just awaiting for create to do to happen, and I will take out this debugger point as well. Now in our ng on init lifecycle method, let's subscribe for that particular subscription. So how can we do that? This .api, so we are referring our API, and here on create to do listener, we are going to subscribe to this particular listener, and there it will send me the new to do as the function parameter to our next method. So we are subscribing to this on create to do listener, and in the next function it will send me the new to do that is being created by another client. So this happened in real time, guys. Well, a GraphQL subscription creates a WebSocket connection with all the connected clients and send this information, right? So the server sends this in real time. So now let's add this to do to our to do array. Let's get this new to do into a variable. So that is inside to do.value.data.create to do. So you have to like go into this particular object. We are going to push this to do into our all to-dos array, new to-do. So let's see if this works. Now again, we are subscribing to this onCreateToDo listener at the ng-on-init method. So whenever the component is loaded, it will subscribe to this event. And once it is subscribed, it will receive all the new to-dos that is created by other clients in real time. So once a new to-do is received, we are like adding it to our all to-dos array. Let me add test to-do, test, create to-do. Well, I get an error. It says cannot read the property of push of undefined. That means this dot to-dos is undefined. So let's see. Yeah, here guys, let's use the arrow function instead of the normal function. So it will correctly reference this with the arrow function. Okay, so let's try now. Hello, create to do. Now it's get added. Okay, let me just clear out all these items in the DynamoDB table. And let's test this in different clients. So I will take two clients here. So this is my first client and this is the other client. So let's test this out. I will type to do, wake up at 5 a.m. and create to do. There you go. It get added here. And in the other client also it was visible. Now let's take another client. I will take a Safari, go to the same localhost 4200 to do. So this is Safari and this is Chrome. This is also Chrome. Let me add another one. Eat breakfast. There you go. So can you see now all these connected clients, they will receive this newly added to do through that subscription in real time and they will render their template. Today we are going to demonstrate the offline capabilities of AppSync. There are two ways of working with AppSync. Basically, you can use the Amplify GraphQL client, which is a very lightweight client where you can easily interact with your AppSync backend, but it does not support advanced features like offline, etc. So if you need advanced features, we have another way, that is using AWS AppSync SDK. So today our main focus is using AWS AppSync SDK and build a small offline application. And I'm going to use Angular framework today because there are a lot of resources for React, but very few resources for Angular. And there are some gotchas we have to be aware of. So let's get started. So I will take a terminal and I am in my desktop. And let's create a directory offline. Cd into offline and I will create new Angular application, ng new my app. Add routing guys, use SCCS and let it create. Okay, cd into my app and open it in Visual Studio Code or any editor you use. I will take an integrated terminal here and now we have to install a couple of libraries. There are 4 libraries that you have to install. First one is the Amplify CLI. You have to install it globally. So write npm install -d at AWS Amplify CLI. And then you have to install AWS Amplify locally and Amplify Angular and also AWS AppSync. This is our AppSync SDK and GraphQL tag library. So let me just copy the first one, install that. I've already done that. Let me show the version that I have. So I have 0.1.45 and let's install the other libraries. npm install AWS Amplify locally, Amplify Angular, and AppSync SDK and GraphQL tag. Alright, it's done. Now if I go to the package.json, have a look at the versions that I have installed. Now before building our application, we have to do a bit of initial configuration to avoid some compile time errors when compiling Angular with Amplify and AppSync. So first thing is you need to go to src and find your index.html at this script tag. So basically it's a reference to the window object which is referred as global. So we need this one, okay? And don't worry guys, I will add a link to the GitHub repository so you guys can easily copy paste the code. Okay, first thing is done. And secondly, you need to go to tsconfig.app.json file and under the compile options, under types, add node. So this is required when compiling application with Amplify. And now you need to go to polyfill.ts, so this file, On top of the file, we have to add two things. First one is a reference to the global object, that is referencing window, and another reference for the process. So these two are required. All right. And also we have to do another configuration in tsconfig.json, this particular file. Here you need to set the attribute called skip libcheck to true. Otherwise you will get some errors when you add the AppSync SDK. So make sure to add these two. I think these are the main configuration we need. So now let's initialize an Amplify project. So I will take the integrated terminal and clear the console. I will type Amplify init. Hit enter. Editor VS Code, JavaScript, Angular, src is our source directory, and build file will be in d/myapp, which is the name of our folder, and build command accept the default, hit enter, start ng server. Right now it's asking whether we want to use the AWS profile. In my case I will add yes. And I have multiple profiles. I will choose YouTube. You guys can choose default, or if you have a profile configured for AWS, use that one. So it's creating the stack. I will fast forward. Okay, done. Now we need to add some AppSync features. So let's clear this out, and I will add the auth first because we need a login. And let's use Cognito user pool authentication for our small to-do application. And I will use the default configurations. Let's add API as well. Amplify add API. Choose GraphQL. Provider API name, my app is fine. And here use Amazon Cognito user pool. Do you have annotated GraphQL schema? No. Yes, I need a guided creation. Single object with fields to do. Do you want to edit? Yes. And she'll open it up. And here guys, I will just take out the description as well. Just want the name of the to do. That's it. So I will save it and hit enter. Okay. Now we need to do amplify push to update the resources in the AWS. Select yes. So it will update both auth and API. And now take this up a little bit so you guys can see. Do you want to generate code for your newly created GraphQL API? Say yes. Then choose the code generation language. Now here guys, you can use TypeScript because here it will create those mutations and subscriptions separately where you can easily import it. So use TypeScript. Accept the defaults. Say yes, I want to generate all. Okay, where should be the file? It should be in source api.ts. Hit enter. Now it's creating the resources. Let's give it a few minutes. Okay, it's created. Now if you go to Amplify folder and into the backend API my app and into the build folder, you can see the GraphQL schema that it's generated. So you have all the queries and mutations and subscriptions, all that, right? And also if you go to your source folder, you should see a new folder created, GraphQL. Inside that you should see the mutations, queries and subscriptions as well, right? Now we can easily import them into our components. So let's create our components. So how many components do I need? I need, let's say, 2 components. ng gc, first one, let's say auth, that will include our login screen. And I will create another one, ng gc to do, that will include our to do application. And also I will create a service file, ng.js AppSync. So let's create a service called AppSync as well. So that is created. So let's see the generated files. Auth component, to do component, and here our AppSync service. Okay, first and foremost guys, we need to register Amplify Angular module and also our service, AppSync service. So let's import it in the app.module.ts file. So this is our main module file. Here let's import Amplify Angular module and Amplify service from AWS Amplify Angular library. So the module, put it inside the imports, and Amplify service, put it inside the provider. Now we need to import the AppSync service as well. So this new service that we just created. So let's import that AppSync service from AppSync service. It should be simple as here, and add this to our providers list as well. Now when we push our AppSync services, it has created this AWS export.ts file, or rather JS file. You can find it in your source folder here, AWS export.js. So it has all the reference to your backend resources like where your user pool ID, and AppSync GraphQL endpoint, etc. So we need to reference this in our application and initialize at start. So go to main.ts file here, and let's import this AWS export file. I import it as Amplify, import Amplify from ./AWS export, and also import the Amplify library itself. Import Amplify from AWS Amplify. Now let's configure Amplify. Amplify.configure configure with our exported configuration. Okay, now it will initialize successfully, but we have to do one other thing. As you can see, our AWS export isa.js file, we have to convert it to TS. We can do it using a script provided in the documentation of Amplify. For that, you go to package.json and you have to replace the start and build command with a script. So if you go to Amplify documentation at this link, and you go to Angular and Ionic menu, and if you scroll down a little bit, you should see the script here. Just copy these two lines. So that is basically converting your JS file to TS on the fly. Just replace start and build. Nice. Okay, now let's add our login screen. Let me go to auth component.html. So this will have our login screen. Clear out the content. Let's use the built-in directive for Amplify Authenticator. So this will easily render our login screen. So import this directive, Amplify-Authenticator, into your auth.component.html. Now for styling this component, you should add the styles as well. Just search your styles.scss file, which is here inside the source directory here, and import Amplify Angular theme. You can find this also in the documentation. So let's see if the things are working fine. So I will type ng serve, so that will start the application locally. Let's see if there are any compilation errors. It seems to be working fine. We forgot to add one thing, that is our routes. So go to your app folder, and in there app-routing.module.ts. So currently we don't have any routes, so let's add some route. I'm going to add two routes here. First one is to do. So if someone navigate to /to-do, it should load up the to-do component. So let's import the to-do component up here. To-do component from to-do component. And also the default route is our auth component that will render our login screen. So I'm not going to add any route guards or anything as such, right? You guys can use it if you want. Auth component from auth/auth component. Okay, and let's navigate to http localhost 4200, and I should see my login screen. I see. Let's remove this default content. I'll go to app component.html and let's remove all this default content. Save that, come back here. It will reload the page, and here's our login screen. So make sure you don't have any errors in the network tab in the inspect element. Now let's add a very basic UI to our to-do component as well. So inside our to-do component, to-do HTML, I'm going to replace it with this bit of HTML. So this is basically rendering an input type or an input box, and then a button to click. So in the input box, you will type the to-do name, and when you click the button, it will fire this create to-do event, and it will pass the to-do name along with that. And under it, we are going to render all the to-dos in an array called all to-dos. So basically, when you click the create to-do, we will add that to-do into this all to-dos array, and that will show it in the screen. So in the JavaScript side, guys, let's import our service first. So I'm importing AppSync service from our AppSync service file, and let's inject this into our constructor. Let's create a private variable called AppSync of type AppSync service. So now we can use this AppSync service, which itself is singleton throughout our components, to talk with our backend services through the AppSync SDK, right? But before that, let's add some configuration or the code to our AppSync service. So I will go to source app and AppSync service here. Currently, we don't have anything. First, I'm going to import AppSync SDK from AWS AppSync. And then we need AWS export file as well, because we are going to use the GraphQL endpoints from this file when configuring our AppSync SDK. Finally, we have to import auth and auth type from AWS Amplify and AppSync auth link, because these are necessary for sending out the credentials of the user when requesting the information. So let's see how to use this. I'm going to paste some code into the constructor. Okay, let's go through that. First, I create a variable called client. So this is basically AWS AppSync client that we have exported up here. So as for the configuration, we have to pass few attributes. First one is the AppSync GraphQL endpoint URL that we get from AWS export file, because inside AWS export file we have this particular endpoint. Let me quickly show you here. So that's the URL and the region. So again, in the same export file, you can get the region as well. Now we have the auth attributes. So auth type is basically, it's a type of Amazon Cognito user pool, because we have initialized a user pool. You can here use the API key if you want, but use Cognito user pool, because that is the standard when it comes to enterprise applications. So you go to pass the ID token along with your request. So that's where we are extracting the ID token from current user session. So we are getting the ID token and send it in attribute called AWT token. So that's our client basically, and we need to export this client. We'll have a variable up here. Let's say HC, and at the bottom of constructor, let's assign underscore HC variable to our client, and let's have another function called HC. So what does this HC mean anyways, guys? So HC is basically hydrated client. Don't need the arrow function here. So here we are returning this dot underscore HC hydrated. Okay, a quick word about AWS AppSync client. So this is basically using Apollo client. So Apollo client is a GraphQL implementation that has offline features as well. So AWS AppSync has created a wrapper or another implementation from Apollo client, and that's what we are using today. So in Apollo client, we can cache all the queries in the local storage or any other storage medium, and here it will wait until the cache is populated. So then only it will return the client or the AppSync client. So let's see how to use this AppSync service. I will go to to-do component. We already imported the AppSync service here. And in our HTML, we have a create to-do function that will fire when the button is clicked. So let's have that function implemented. So I will create an async function for that. So it will pass the to-do name here as the parameter, and let's check if to-do name has some value, and if so, let's create AppSync client. So I created a constant called client, and I'm awaiting this .appsync.hc. So this .appsync is our service here, and hc is the function that returns the hydrated client, right? So we are waiting for the client, and afterwards we have to create our mutation. So what is the mutation? It's basically creating this to do in the database, right? So let's look at our mutations. So if you can remember, inside our GraphQL folder we have mutations. So here's our create to do mutation. So we need to export, or rather import, this mutation into our to do component. So let's do that. I will import create to do mutation from GraphQL mutations, and also I'm going to import GraphQL tag library as well. Import GQL from GraphQL tag, and let's import other tools as well, like the queries and the subscription, because we have mutations, so we may need the queries and subscriptions, or at least queries. So I'm importing the list to do's queries from this queries.ts file here inside the GraphQL, and I have create to do mutation as well. So how do we make this mutation, guys? So basically, now that we have the AppSync client, we can simply use client.mutate, right? And add the mutation together with the passing to do value. So that is fine, but are we using the offline features yet? No, right? So in order to use offline functionality, we have to make sure that if there's no network, cache whatever the mutation in the local storage or whatever the storage medium that we are using for our front-end application. And thanks to Apollo client, it will maintain a map or a queue of all the mutation that is being added during the offline. So it will maintain this queue. So this queue will have all the mutations. Let's say you added 3 to-dos. So it will first add the to-do 1 into this queue, offline queue. And when you add the second to-do, it will push this to the queue, that one as well. So similarly, it will like populate this queue in your local storage at the front end, right? So whenever the network is back, so when you're online, so it will start executing this queue item from the order that they were received. So it will start from the first element or the first item and it will go to the last element that was added. So now to call this functionality, there are two ways. First one is either you can use an update function that will be called when offline as well as when it is back online. Or you can use the build mutation helper from AppSync SDK, which is the recommended method. So let's use build mutation. For that, I need to import build mutation up here first. Import build mutation from AWS AppSync. And here, let's get the result of the mutation into a variable called result. SULT. Okay. And I'm going to copy paste some code here. Okay. Now let's go through this code. So I created this constant call result and I am awaiting the client again on a method called mutate. So this is basically the function that called the mutation from the AppSync SDK. So client.mutate. And so inside the parentheses, we have to pass our build mutation function. So the build mutation function, so as we have imported up here, so we say it's build mutation and inside that build mutation, it accepts several parameters. Here's the first parameter. So it is the first parameter is the client, our Apollo client, right? Or AppSync client rather. And then we have to pass the mutation. So which mutation are we going to call? It's the create to do mutation, right? So create to do mutation we have imported up here and I'm going to wrap that mutation using GraphQL tag library. So GQL. So this will add proper GraphQL tags to our create to do mutation. And then the third one, we have to pass the input type. So we have not yet imported our create to do input. So let's do that at once. So we need to import the inputs as well. So currently we don't have any inputs associated here. So I will create a new file called inputs.ts and here I'm exporting the create to do inputs. Let me paste that. So from where did I get this? So I'll show you. So it's basically this text that I copied from our GraphQL schema. So if you can remember, our GraphQL schema is available inside our Amplify folder in the current backlog, API, in the build, GraphQL, and here you have create to do input. Just copy this and come back here and paste it in here. So simply add two backticks and export it. Now we can import it from here. So in our to do component.ts file, so I'm going to import that, create to do imports from GraphQL inputs. Nice. So now our error is gone. So we are decorating that again with GraphQL tags and variables. So variables is basically the inputs that we are providing it, right? So as you have already seen, it is expecting a name, the to-do name, and that is a mandatory field, right? So in our AppSync backend, we are generating this ID automatically. So we just have to pass the name here. So as our variable, we are passing to do name dot value. Oh, we have to pass this as an object. So let me just take it out. I will add object literals here. Name has to be to do name dot value. Nice. So then we are passing another query, list to do's query, as we have imported it up here. So we have imported list to do's queries as well. So why do we actually need these guys? So in build mutation, So what basically happens is if it is offline, if there's no network, what Apollo client does is it will use one of the queries that has cached earlier in the local storage. So here it used the list to dos query. So it will read all the to dos or the list of to dos that it has cached earlier. So it reads it from the cache and add this newly created value into the cache or the list to dos array. So it will read the cache and write the new item into the cache as well. So finally, we have to pass the to do type. So that is also required. So when the network is back, it will play all the mutation that is recorded inside the cache. And there's another concept called optimistic UI update. So that is basically when there's no network, obviously result is not going into the database, right? And it is stayed in the cache. But we will update the UI even though it is not persisted in the database so that it will give a better user experience for whoever the user using the application. So how to do that optimistic UI update? So once we have built the mutation and it returns the results here, let's push into the array that we are referencing in the UI. So that is all to do's, and I'm going to push the result that is returned here. So that is all to do's, and I think we have not references up here as well. So let's add that variable up here, all to do's of any type. And down here let's push that item in the cache into this dot all to do's dot push, and it is inside the result variable result dot data dot create to do. And let's empty our to do name value as well so it will look nice on the UI. All right, now when loading up this component, I need to show all the to-dos that has been earlier added, right? So let's populate these all to-dos with a query by calling the list to-dos query using our AppSync client. So in ng on init, I'm going to paste this code. So I pasted this code. So it's basically this .appsync.hide client. So we are calling our service and then you get a client, and inside that client we are calling the watch query. So that will basically do a query on list to dos which we have imported up here, and the fetch policy is cache and network. It's basically check cache and then go into the network, and we are subscribing to the data that is returned from the query, and we are setting this all to dos to the data that is returned from here. It is data dot list to dos dot items. Right now, as I previously mentioned, this code will be available in the GitHub link below. Okay, now it all looks good. So let's see if it is actually working. So I will go to my UI and do a refresh and make sure you don't get any errors. And now let's create an account. Click create account, give a username, password. You have to add capital and numbers there. Sign up. Okay, you should receive an email to your email address. Get that code and paste it here and confirm it. So then you'll redirect to the login page again. So type your password, sign in. Okay, now you are signed in. So now let's navigate to do. Okay, I don't see any errors. That looks good. And let's try to add a to do, shall we? Go to gym. Yes, it added. Beautiful. Let's verify that. I will go to aws.amazon.com and into my DynamoDB. Log into your console, guys. Okay. And this is my table here. Click on that. And in the items, there you have it. So it persisted. Beautiful. So let's add another one. Eat healthy. Yep, that is also added. Let's check that. There you go. Now let's try our offline. So I'm going to click here and turn off my Wi-Fi. So it's turned off, and I will add offline to do. Let's see if I see a network request. It is directly added thanks to our optimistic UI response. But as you have seen, there is no any network call. So let's reconnect our Wi-Fi and have a look at here. You should see the request will automatically be made. There you go. This is the request that got automatically made. And now if you go to DynamoDB and refresh it, there I have the offline to do. Beautiful. If I refresh it again, you see those are indeed persisted. So this is what I want to show you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this. And if you guys like my videos, so if you want to see this nature of content, please like and subscribe to my channel, guys. Thank you very much.